Jim, let's start with you here. What is the big takeaway here from this majority opinion issued today on the Trump immunity?
The big takeaway is that the president is immune for official acts. He's not immune for anything that is an unofficial act. So, but the court really does parse each of the allegations against President Trump and then decides whether it's an official or an unofficial act, but it doesn't go that far. What we have here is it's going to be certain to go back to the Supreme Court again because they remanded to the district court for most of the president's actions to determine whether his conduct was an official act or an unofficial act. The only one of the allegations that they determined, and I think this is really dangerous, that would be an official act is his conversations with the Justice Department. And they said, look, that is within the president's purview to have discussions with his Justice Department, make decisions, and even threaten to fire people if they don't do what they want to do. That's an official act. He's immune from prosecution. Well, there you have it. If Trump is elected president, he tells the Justice Department, don't pursue this prosecution. And no matter what he does in order to gain that goal, he's not going to be prosecuted. So this election really does determine whether or not this prosecution will continue. And the court has really made it last as long with remanding it to the district court to make that determination that we will certainly not have a decision prior to the November election.
And then what can we take away from the dissent? Are there arguments there that the court, in particularly the case involving Judge Shutkin, can use in any of her arguments? I know she has to take what she gets from the majority.
Well, I think the dissent really points out the danger of this decision. And yes, the trial judge will have difficulty seizing upon the dissent in order to determine whether something is official versus non-official, because it's a minority opinion. This was a 6-3 decision. But I think that dissent really places a warning across the bow of the United States of America and the people that, look, what is taking this to the logical extreme? If a president, for instance, and this is what Justice Sotomayor says, orders that the Navy SEAL team assassinates a political rival, organizes a military coup in order to retain power, that can be considered an official act and they will be absolutely immune. So the idea that a president can be above the law seems to be contrary to what the founding fathers intended. I mean, they wanted to get away from a king being in charge and that the king's dictates would rule and to have a balance of powers. And this seems to give the balance of power, in my view, too much to the president. But we'll see what happens when the district court makes those determinations.
I guess from that political perspective and from our historical perspective too, Professor Smith, it's like those old Nixon tapes coming to life here in a real life situation, is it?
I'm glad you raised that because I mean, as soon as I read the opinion, that's immediately where my mind went to, which is, you know, the Frost-Nixon conversation and the statement that Nixon made that kind of horrified the nation at that point, which is if the president does it, it's not illegal. And the court seems to be saying today that if the president does something insofar as it's part of his official duties as president, then yeah, it's not illegal. He can't be prosecuted for it. And so, you know, if there's and beyond just an absolute immunity for constitutional duties, the court said that there's a presumptive immunity for anything that's going to be done in their official capacity. So it makes it really hard for any prosecutor anywhere to bring charges against the sitting president to say that this action was criminal. Yeah.
It's interesting to really look at that and look at what this perhaps has an effect on an election, because it's not just anybody, it's the person who's the Republican nominee. What impacts do you think politically does this have? I know everyone's still reeling on the back end of the debate. Do you think this has any electoral impacts at the moment or not?
I would say in terms of the election, no, this is not going to have much of an impact on the election, except as Mr. DeSimone said, to preclude any kind of end to the case before the November election. This is the court cases are going to drag on past the election. If Trump wins, then the court cases are going to disappear, or at least the federal cases are going to disappear, because the court said that the president has the absolute right to direct the Justice Department to prosecute some people and not others. And so he will have the absolute ability, if Trump wins, to say we're not doing this anymore, and to drop the case. But for voters, it's noise in the background for everything else that's happening right now.
And Jim, for you, I mean, is that pretty much articulating what you're thinking? I know you had mentioned it earlier in the statement as well, that some of these cases could potentially go away that are against Trump.
Well, I think the challenge with the electorate, I mean, first of all, would it have an impact on our broader nation? It would, but because of the Electoral College, it really only matters in a certain number of states and for a certain number of undecided voters, which is dwindling. So will it have an impact on the election? That's hard to say. But, America loves an underdog story. And I think all of us saw that debate last week, and, it wasn't President Biden's finest moment, but people are also rallying around him, and it's an underdog story, and people don't like bullies. And in this instance, if the United States Supreme Court has now basically given carte blanche to a president to be a bully, to use the power of that office, because there's that old saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and now the Supreme Court has basically handed to the president this mantle of absolute power. And Trump has indicated that, look, I'm going to be the dictator from day one. This is the retribution tour. So I think in some ways, if people really who are undecided have faith in America's democracy and want to live in a country in which democracy is respected, maybe when you look at the implications of this decision, people may be persuaded that they don't want to give a president who has already indicated that he's willing to abuse that power in a way to incite individuals on January 6, 2021, to attempt to interfere with our democratic process and have the duly elected President Biden to be elected, that maybe we don't want to give someone like that much power, and maybe it will have an impact on the electorate.
Yeah, I think the interesting follow-up to, in my opinion, is going to be, because they just can't let these arguments go, is going to be a back and forth over presidential records, and I guess in Biden's case, vice presidential records, right, during his time. So I think is that a big question too, whether this immunity extends beyond just the president to his vice president, or just anyone that spends time in the executive branch. I think is another big question, right? Because you would have to imagine that's going to be brought up in another debate, and then it's going to be flung back and forth because there will be both claims over the records.
So I guess how do I want to say it? The court's opinion is about the president acting in his official capacity as president. And there is within our constitutional system an end to when someone is president. It's when the next they stop being president at 11:59 and almost 12 p.m. and then the next person becomes president at 12 p.m. And so the immunity that the court has now said the president has ends when the person stops being president. So retaining records after that is a wholly separate question, because the court did clearly state that when it's not an official action, there is no immunity, and you can't have an official action if you're not president of the United States. More generally, similarly, I think with President Biden and when he was vice president, and the retaining of records, and other officials who retained records after they ceased to hold the official position, that's a separate issue, right? That's not acting in an official capacity. That's now you're just a citizen like everybody else. What rights do you have to the materials, and what do you have to do with them? So I think those questions are still live. It's just what can the president do as president, and what kind of limits are there now for the president acting in that capacity? And if you believe the dissenting opinion, it's carte blanche. at this point, that presidents can do basically anything they want, because if it's official capacity, then there's a presumptive belief that it's fine. If you take Roberts at his word, Chief Justice Roberts at his word, then it's a much more limited right, and that all has to be worked out for the district, in the lower courts, at the trial court, at the district court level, to figure out what qualifies for immunity and what doesn't, because there is no record at this point on that question, because we've never had a former president prosecuted in the way that people are prosecuting President Trump.
I wonder what your view, if I could ask a question of Professor Smith on this one is. I mean, you have that situation where we've all heard the phone call with Georgia's governor, where he's like, I need the 11,000 votes. Just get me those votes. You know there's fraud there. Give me those votes. Now, Trump's defense is, hey, I'm working for a fair election, but clearly he's asking for a governor to manufacture votes that don't exist in order to have Georgia's electoral support Trump. Seems to be outside of an official duty there, because he's subverting democracy. But on the other hand, if you look at it from the perspective of, I'm president, I want a fair election, then it's within the official duty. I mean, how does the district court parse this out?
I don't know that there's an easy answer to that question, right? And I do. This was kind of the thing that Justice Barrett highlighted in her concurring opinion was, working with the Justice Department as the Justice Department is one thing. Reaching out to state election officials in an attempt to affect their decision making doesn't seem to be the same kind of thing, and therefore there may not be the same protections or immunity for those kinds of actions. And in particular, she referenced the reaching out that President Trump did in Arizona and trying to convince people in Arizona not to certify the election there. And she would have held that there was no immunity in that instance, but the Roberts opinion seems to imply that there is. Which is why she filed the concurring opinion and said, I disagree with this part of the analysis. But even there, with her not agreeing to that, there's still 5 votes on the Supreme Court saying that he has immunity in that instance. And so that's now what the district court has to parse and try and apply in each of the charges that have been brought. Is this constitutional? If yes, then we can't touch it. Is it official? Okay, would it then make it impossible for the president to act as president if the charges were pursued, or any future president to act as president if the charges were pursued? And if the answer to that question is yes, then we can't prosecute. So, I mean, it just really makes it difficult at this point to see what the limits are. I mean, how, where you draw the line. And I know courts love lines, and they want to say it's on this side of the line, it's prohibited. If it's on that side of the line, it's not. I don't know where the lines are anymore on this.
I think that's the major problem with the Supreme Court's decision here, is that it didn't lay down any bright lines of what is official versus non-official acts. It's basically remanded it to the district court without necessarily a lot of guidance. And, we hear so much about state rights. And of course, our system of electing a president is based on it dividing up the electoral college state by state, so that states put forth their electoral slate in order to elect the president. And I think that what's dangerous here is that then President Trump, and even after the election, of course, I mean, he was going into these to convince, persuade, pressure state officials to put forth a slate of electoral voters that was inconsistent with the popular vote in those individual states. I mean, there would seem to be that the Supreme Court could have set forth a bright line, says that is a bridge too far for a president who is to interfere in the state's processes in that way. And yet this gives wiggle room where the district court, I mean, even if the district court comes down and then decides, oh, yes, that is an unofficial act because he's going against the will of the people in those states, where's it going to go?
Can
back
go
up,
right back. Yeah.
right back to the Supreme Court. And as Professor Smith pointed out, you've got 5 justices who might be willing to reverse that decision and say, no, if he just in good faith thought that it was a mistake, he could do whatever he wants. And that's, I mean, our country is founded on a democracy. And I think that, all of the studies, everyone who investigated, his own Justice Department who looked into this said, look, these allegations of election fraud that you keep putting out in these different jurisdictions, I mean, there's just no evidence there. And ultimately, one of the things that truly made our country great was the peaceful transition of power, that presidents would put, the country over themselves. And when you had that transition of power, I mean, I think we know that President Trump did not exactly cooperate with the Biden administration when there was the transfer of power. In fact, it was exactly the opposite. That's a really sad day for the United States of America, that you would have a situation where the institutions that form the bedrock of our country no longer seem to be respected because one man has placed himself above the country when he lost an election and really couldn't take it and did everything he can in order to change the will of the people. And the Supreme Court seems to have, instead of coming down and saying, no, this was too far, because he's running for president again, they, in some ways, they're enablers. They've enabled him to get away with it because it's not going to be decided before November now.
Well, I think the big question here too is when we think about Trump in this scenario, and of course that's the first person who comes to mind of being involved in this case. I talked with a political strategist earlier today. It says it maybe also gives a lot of leeway to the current president of the United States to act in a way as well. Not that we would infer that he would act a particular way, but what what takeaways should President Biden have from this, and perhaps learn from, and if the Justice Department wants to appeal, or of course, as we said, this could bounce back and forth. What should that takeaway be for the Biden administration?
So this court, the Roberts Court in particular, has had a program of constructing a strong executive, constructing a strong presidency through the arc of the rulings that have come out of the Roberts Court. They have invested a lot of power in the office of the president. Not so much the bureaucracy, not so much the executive branch, but the president's control of the executive branch. And so, we're focusing on Trump because that's the motivation for this particular case. But I think what has happened here and what has happened in some of the other rulings from this term as well as prior terms is that presidents today are assumed to have a lot of control and very few formal checks on that control over the executive branch. And the court seems to be saying that if the president decides that something ought to happen, once the other branch, once Congress has passed a law, it's up to the president to make the decision about what happens at that point. And there were limits that, they just said with overturning Chevron that the courts are going to have a role in making sure that what the president decides is statutorily correct, is constitutionally correct, but the presumption is that the president is the one that's going to decide. And so most of our policy fights are over how we understand what Congress has said, what the law says. And this is just part of a broader pattern where the courts have said the president is the one that gets to decide, and we'll check if the president's understanding is correct, and kind of taking Congress out of the equation once Congress passes a law. So I read this as just a further strengthening of whomever the president happens to be. That person has more authority to decide what the executive branch is going to be doing.
Well, I agree with that. I think that it gives perhaps Biden the opportunity to, in some instances where he can do things that are going to be for the benefit of the American people, for instance, in student loans or environmental regulations or things like that, where he can put some pressure because he doesn't have, because of this decision, and would be an official act in order to say, look, I'm exercising my power in a way that's benevolent and for the good of the people. The danger would be, I mean, this decision would be another. He could tell the prosecutors who are prosecuting his son, hey, drop the prosecution or you're fired, right? But of course, that wouldn't be very good for him in November if he abused his power in that way. So, I think it does give him an opportunity between now and November to show the American people, where he sees his contrast with Trump as someone who is, trying to do his best for the American people, and especially the common man, in order to take some real steps in order to do something concrete that people can point to, and perhaps it will impact decision making when it comes time when people enter the ballot booth.
Yeah, final question for you guys. Thank you. I know we've gone a little over time as well, but I just wanted to ask you, what is the takeaway here for people in California, maybe people in Kern County? What should the headline be for them, very simply, for what happened today?
I would go back to Nixon's statement to Frost in those interviews. I mean, the court seems to be saying that Nixon was right. If the president, or when the president does it, it's not illegal.
I think that's absolutely right. So people have to really take a look at, if you're going to give that type of power to the president, you have to think long and hard and carefully about who you want in that office. And do you want someone who may have the predilection for abusing that power, or do you want someone who has been a little bit more, although Democrats are seen as liberal, but conservative in their view in terms of, not trying to interfere with the prosecution in certain instances. I mean, Biden's own son being prosecuted being an example of that, you let the chips fall where they may in that situation. And the question would be, if the shoe is on the other foot, would that have happened? So hopefully voters will take a look at this and vote with their conscience and decide what kind of country they want to live in.
Well, thank you both so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Hi, I'm Rochelle Murcia with Eyewitness News Bakersfield Now on YouTube. Thank you for checking out our YouTube channel, where we have tons of great content to choose from. While you're here, go ahead and click on the subscribe button right there. That way you can stay up to date on all the things related within Kern County. Thanks for watching.